Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. The digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Meghan Fitzgerald, a global healthcare operator, strategist, investor, and academic, and author of the book Ascending Davos.
1000%.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled to welcome you to another installment of our virtual breakfast series, albeit not on Tuesday this week. Due to the Labor Day holiday and back to school and all of the other things that are going on, we decided to shift, and we were able to secure our guest today on a Thursday time slot, which made it all the more appropriate for us to switch. So I just wanted to, in addition to giving you a welcome, remind you that our NewYorkBIO annual meeting digital version is next Tuesday and Wednesday morning. We hope you'll join us. If you can go to our website, you can register there, and Derek has sent out a discount code for those of you who have joined us in our virtual breakfast. So be sure to check your email for that. And also, as always, thank you to our sponsor who makes these breakfasts possible. This month we have TriNet is our sponsor, and we very much appreciate their engagement in our ecosystem and their ability to make your job doing biotech business easier by taking care of HR functions. So with that, I'm going to flip it over to Derek to introduce Meg, and we'll get going. Thanks.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Meg. We are absolutely psyched to have you here. So we usually start these things with a bit of an origin story, and yours is fantastic. It literally takes you from, the front lines of healthcare all the way through, the corporate ladder and into public policy and investing. So why don't you give us a little bit of a sense of where you came from, and we'll dig into it because we've got a lot of fun stuff to talk about.
Great to see you two, and thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited there is a New York bio, being born in New York and loving everything about New York. So it's a real honor to be with you guys. So I began my career out west in Nogales, Arizona, which is almost on the border of Arizona and Mexico, working on the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation, doing diabetes care and dialysis. And it really was my first foray into public health and population health, because you got to do primary care. Really the only care that was provided on the reservation came from, the dialysis and kidney care that we gave to the people on the reservation. And therefore it led to flu shots and preventative care and mommy baby care. And it really, lit a fire in me, which led me to eventually go back to school and get a master's in public health and then a doctorate in public health. So it's been something that's really been part of my journey. Then was able to pivot into corporate America, worked at Merck, worked at Pfizer, ran life cycle management for Pfizer. And then I went to what we call the access side of the equation. There's the demand side, and then there's, well, how does all of this get paid for? And I worked for one of the largest PBMs, which was Medco. Ironically, when I was at Merck, there was a joint venture and a coming together of Merck and Medco, which, as you can see, maybe a PBM and a drug manufacturer didn't make a lot of sense. It separated. And after Medco, I went on to work at Cardinal Health on the distribution side. I sit on the board at Tenet, and I teach up at Columbia in the School of Public Health. So I've pretty much been through the whole 18% of GDP and absolutely love it. I can see myself doing nothing else. And now I'm on the private equity investing side, which means I get to pick in each of those domains where I like to spend my time. And I still very much love biopharma. It seems to be where I have an affinity and a lot of interest. And there's just been a ton of innovation. So it's been really fun.
That's fantastic. So we had sent out this link earlier with our email, and I'll send it out again. You had written a book called Ascending Davos, all of the profits from which go to the Harlem Children's Zone. And it goes through your story in a ton of detail. And like you said, you've hit virtually every single facet of the healthcare system. And it's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on today, because, literally we think about the way that COVID has impacted our society and our industry. And it really encompasses everything from drug discovery to delivery of healthcare to the PPE supply chain, all the way down to the last mile problems and how we actually get healthcare, access healthcare in disparate populations. So when we started thinking about this, I wanted to split our conversation a little bit from in-hospital care to what I'll call ex-hospital or out-of-hospital care. And you've spent a lot of time on Twitter and on CNBC talking a little bit about hospitals as a business, right? And I think one of the things that's been highlighted here is a bit of the fragility of the supply chain of actually getting things into the hospital to deliver care to patients. Do you feel like we've learned some lessons here if we think about hospital infrastructure in terms of how we're going to care for patients in the future?
Yeah, what a great question. So listen, I think we learned a huge lesson on the side of public health. So right now, for every dollar we spend in healthcare, 7 cents, just about a nickel, goes to public health. So clearly, everybody would say there wasn't a big focus on prevention and pandemic preparedness. In fact, that division had been shut down. So I think everybody now knows a few things. One, we need to think about surveillance, prevention, in terms of the population, but also in terms of the supply chain. I think when you think of the supply chain, nobody was really ready for a surge, right? It suddenly went up by 100x to what we need. And things that are PPE tend to be low margin goods, meaning you try and buy them at the cheapest price at scale. And therefore, they're often sole sourced. And that's why a lot of the product came from China and India, and it wasn't a quality problem. It's just that's where we were able to make it in large volumes for a low price point. So now I think there is a big discussion around, do we bring everything back, to the United States? And I think the solution really is just don't have sole source. Make sure that you have adequate supplies being made in multiple locations, so you're not dependent on one site or one channel to get those supplies, because pricing also matters. So if you suddenly decided to bring everything back to the United States, the pricing would then be passed on to a patient. So I believe that's already going on. Everybody's already thinking about spreading out where they source PPE and masks. And I don't think that is going to be a problem again. I also think people will carry more inventory. Before, you literally carried, almost just-in-time inventory, because there wasn't a lot of space to put all of this stuff because it got in the way of patient care in the hospital. Every time I volunteered during COVID down in the hospital in Florida, the supply rooms are getting smaller and smaller. So there really wasn't a whole half a floor that was going to have masks and gloves and all kinds of gear. So I think we're learning now, where do we source the supplies? Where do we put the supplies? How do we pay for them? And I think I'm not really worried about that going forward.
Well, and there's a good reason that the supply chain is international. I mean, and some of them are policy reasons. Some of them are financial reasons. Some of them are tax implication reasons, not only on PPE, but across the therapeutics as well. And so just to flip a switch and try to bring all of that back to the US honestly doesn't make a lot of sense. To be thoughtful and recognize where we have weaknesses now, that and address those first and then look down the road, that seems to make more sense to me.
By the way, Jennifer, it's such a good point you bring up. I just read a McKinsey report earlier this week, and they didn't cite supply chain as being the number one issue. They said it was tariffs and cybersecurity, to your point, that it was more around, if there's a trade war, who pays for this and stuff. So it's actually very complicated, but you bring up a really good point. But it wasn't sourcing that McKinsey was worried about, ironically.
Yeah. I feel like that's what we're always saying. I feel like someone has a bumper sticker and our industry has a white paper.
Right, exactly. Really good point.
So if we go past supply chains, what does a hospital look like in the future? If it's, is it still going to be highly dependent on, certain types of procedures? If we think about it, the level, it's not just the supply chains that were really stressed. It was actually the entire economic chain of the hospital, because there are, like a lot of businesses, there are certain things in a hospital that are money makers. There are certain things that are, that are crucial for patient care, but may not be money makers. And that's really a big distinction, because a hospital can't just abandon its patients, right? It has that actual duty to actually provide care.
Yeah, well, I think the hospitals became more valuable during the pandemic because everyone realized the path to economic, prosperity was through the U.S. hospital system. So if our population wasn't, safe and healthy, they weren't going to be able to work. So it was the front line of defense before we did anything. So I actually think, this is my dog, so I have to shut the door.
Listen, he's going to have to raise his hand like everyone else if he has something to
who
say.
do you think you are?
He can use the chat window. There's several opportunities for him to speak.
Exactly. He's got to get in the queue. So I think the U.S. hospital system became more valuable because I think a lot of people took it for granted. They just assumed it would always be there. There wouldn't be a problem. Next thing you know, there's surge of patients coming in. There's lack of supplies. And for some of my friends around the United States, they were calling me saying, I'm being furloughed, but yet I don't have any COVID patients. So I'm going home. I'm being asked to give up some of my check and my pay, but yet I don't have people coming in. And then I have a family member that is not able to go in and get cancer care because the hospital is on shutdown for only COVID patients. So I started writing about this because I was really worried that patients weren't getting care and that we were over rotating. And I love the policy that came out that said, listen, you need to keep 30% capacity open in your ICU for COVID patients, meaning we're always going to have white space and we're always going to have room. But it's not 100%, where the hospital was prohibited from seeing patients, doing elective procedures, which, as you said, is how they get paid. It's a balanced portfolio. In order to take care of, the more costly things that don't make a lot of money, you need to do, you need to do other procedures. And not everything is elective. I think this was a misnomer. Not everything is, plastic surgery. Most things that are emergent are elective. For instance, you elect to have a cardiac stent put in. That's actually coded as an elective surgery. And I think I worried, and I knew the data was going to come, and it did, that 80% of patients across the United States experienced a delay. 60% put off a surgery. And I think more concerning is a lot of breast cancer patients said that they were having a delay. In fact, I think it was half of breast cancer patients said they were having a delay in getting care. So I was worried about the knock-on effects, that the hospital really is central and center for a lot of people to get all of their care, especially if you live in a rural location or a remote location. The hospital is all you have. So I must say I was worried in the beginning, but then I saw the adaptation of the policy real time, where they started opening up the hospitals and allowing people to come back and doing the right thing. Policy should be guided at the federal level, but it really needs to be implemented at the local level, because local hospitals know what they can handle. They know if they have PPE, they know how many nurses they have, they know their population, they know their testing capacity. And so I was happy to see the pivot, but it really started coming late, and a lot of hospitals went out of business. There was a lot of damage done because of that policy.
Well, we had here in New York, I think, obviously, but I think one thing is we had such a dire situation, like almost in like 10 days, we were at capacity, right? And so I think that fear, which was a very real situation, went across the country and created fear in certain hospitals in certain regions where they probably weren't going to ever hit the kind of capacity that we had. And it was,
God forbid they did, right?
Yeah,
You understand why there was an over rotation, right? It was,
And we actually had one of our earlier guests is my friend Barbara Murphy, who's the chief of medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. And she talked us through all of the things, all of the maneuvers they took internally to try and address capacity and treatment of other conditions. And it was interesting, but it also made me realize the amount of work each individual system had to go through, just not only around COVID, but also what you're talking about is to try and continue to see patients, because other things didn't stop happening just because we had COVID, right?
Yeah.
Oh, in fact, I wrote also on this that all the other epidemics continued on, if anything, got worse, so whether it was addiction or loneliness, 35 million people live alone. And as you age, there's no one there for you to help with food. And we had a lot of people in Florida looking for help to get to a doctor's office. And a lot of seniors were afraid of getting, food. Obesity, everyone sheltered in place and they weren't able to go to the gym. So all these other epidemics didn't go away. If anything, they were amplified. And that also became a concern, which ties us all the way back, right, to public health and prevention and funding this and doing it the right way. It wasn't just COVID. A lot of other things happened, as you said, in parallel.
Yep. And it makes us think really about what we can call either the last mile problem or anything else, which is really how does healthcare get into your house, and how do you actually access it? So there's two things that I think we can go here. And the first, I think we can think a little bit about telehealth, right? And where do we see telehealth actually picking up, either picking up momentum or picking up some of the slack in the ability of people to leave and go access healthcare elsewhere? Do you see telehealth as something that is making penetrance into places like mental health or other places where it was previously in person, or you previously had to go to the doctors or another location to get it?
Yeah, listen, I think, I said this before, telehealth got teleported 5 years because of COVID. I was moderately bullish. I liked it. I use it. But I'm an early adopter of things that are all tech. That's not the case for my mom. And now you have my mom seeing her primary care physician on telehealth. So I am hugely bullish that telehealth is here to stay because we all got used to it. It's the same reason we're all doing Zoom and we're doing electronic meetings and we're very comfortable with it. So I think, two things. One, we're real time practicing it. And second, Medicare is reimbursing it. So those two things I think are going to propel telehealth forward. Never going to replace probably an in-office visit or looking at someone or doing a full workup. But what a great supplement to care, especially for people that can't get it. And I think also a lot of people are doing addiction counseling and all of their meetings online because they still need to see people. They still want accountability and be able to look at somebody and reach out. So I honestly think it came at the perfect time. And telehealth, it's probably one of the bright spots of COVID, and that is that more people are now able to access care at a lower price point because it's being reimbursed. It wasn't always being reimbursed before, and it wasn't always allowed to be used across state lines. So I think, kudos to HSS and a lot of the regulators for leaning into this and making that possible.
Yep. It makes, when you make people consider, a new modality because it's desperate and it's important, you get uptake, you get actual, the user experience in the system, then the system can adapt. And like you said, it might not be everywhere all at once, but there may be certain pieces of the process that it's actually quite good at. And now you have the emergence of, tech companies that have developed chatbots or other things that are actually, again, quite useful from a telehealth perspective. Now it gives these things the opportunity to actually get into more mainstream things, or at least niche opportunities where they're quite good and actually, delivering good health and good care to patients.
Yeah, I'm getting great care. I've done quite a few. I'm an asthmatic, and so a little bit hard to do respiratory tests, but certainly someone can look at you, they can see how you're breathing. It's been really, I think, just a huge advancement forward.
Yeah,
so
we actually have a question. Oh, yeah,
I was going to say the same thing. This is a great gateway question.
So it says, regarding telehealth, how do we ensure we have a more uniform way of giving access between people that don't have the technology, whatever the reason is, and the ones that cannot handle technology? How do we avoid having more left out of the system? And I actually have an example. So we did a sort of as the pandemic ramped up, besides ordering toilet paper in February, which my 14-year-old told me to do because he had read about Hong Kong and the toilet paper.
He's a prepper.
Yes. We ordered a kit, which includes for telehealth, it has the tools to be able to listen to your heart, listen to your lungs, so I would be an example of someone probably who wasn't sure how to use those pieces, even though I technically had access to that technology. How do we make it more uniform? Is it an insurance responsibility to make that more uniform, or is it a provider responsibility?
Yeah, it's funny. When I think of uniform, I think more of like access, because remember, a lot of people in remote locations or people that are below the poverty level don't have broadband. So this is like, for some, this is a first world opportunity, but not for everybody. So I know a lot of seniors in Florida, I've counseled them just to use their phone because they're not equipped to do the computer, and I can show them the phone themselves. So I think you have to be willing to use a phone. I don't know that anyone's giving out iPads. You wonder if we get to that level. I also think it's amazing to look at the Apple store in Naples, Florida. Their whole Genius Bar was set up, and all you see is seniors around it. They're very much in tune with helping the senior make this decision. And it's a longer sales cycle because you're having to sit down and show them how to use FaceTime and Zoom and all of these apps. But if you go there, as I've done with my mom, they're spending the time helping the chronologically advantaged get more hip with technology, and the data shows they're actually quite hip. And there was a lot of people at that Genius Bar in skinny jeans and convertibles, and don't think just because you're 70 you don't know what's going on. So I actually think our senior population is a lot more hip, and some of the Medicare data shows the uptake actually, because you can look at who's reimbursed for the visit, that they're using their computer, they're using their phone. My concern, and it's a good question by the person that asked it, is more, what do you do with the people that can't afford it? And I wonder, is giving a device going to offset, will there be a higher outcome? Somebody will likely do a study to say, listen, somebody with a chronic disease, and by the way, as you age, you're over 65, you have 5 chronic conditions. It might be a good investment to be able to give somebody that technology, because it would offset, they'd see it on the outcome side of it. So I think it'll be interesting to see how telehealth embraces this, because their goal is to make this ubiquitous. So they may have to be part of the solution and look at that. You know what it reminds me of? It's analogous to transportation. A lot of people miss a chemotherapy or an infusion because they don't have transportation. And so a lot of the pharma companies helped with that. That was, kind of an obstacle to getting an infusion. And so I wonder with telehealth, will we see people lean in on that? We're also seeing that. You mentioned the Harlem Children's Zone earlier. A lot of kids weren't able to do Zoom. They didn't have broadband. And so I'd heard that a lot of private investors set up towers, or were trying to help get people broadband and help send computers, because it was an obstacle to people learning. And so you wonder, is there parallels what we're seeing in education with healthcare, where people will lean in and help? But it's a good question. I don't have all the answers, obviously.
And I do think USDA is working also to bring broadband to rural areas. And I don't know how fast they're able to roll that out, but I know that's been a priority.
Yeah, I mean, I taught at Columbia this spring, and it all went to Zoom, and every class, about 10% of my class was in a location where they didn't have access. And this is Columbia. So they had a call in, and that's the best that we can do. And we went with it because that's what they were able to do. You meet people where they are.
Yeah. So we've touched on this a little bit now, but I actually want to go a little bit deeper here, because one of your big topics that you talk on is social determinants of health. And, we're talking a little bit about solutions that are, things that are making headway in certain areas. But, I think from a broad perspective, we have a lot to think about in terms of how we deliver care to a lot of people. Like, we're talking about solutions that, will have certain uptake areas, but how do we think as a healthcare system and as an industry about, populations that, aren't often involved in clinical trials, or, like you said, people that are alone, people that are in a lot of ways left out of our care system? What are some of the ways that we should think about that? What are some of the ways that we can actually get people more involved and make headway on a broader scale?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought, that's what I got my master's and PhD in. So I just so ironic to now hear that it's popular and people are addressing it and understanding that it's actually a healthcare problem, not someone else's problem. Where you live, access to good nutrition, access to primary care, whether you have broadband, that all fits in the socio-determinants of health. It's basically where you live and how you live your life. And so a great example is when I was volunteering in Florida, we had 3 patients on my floor that were homeless. And so we couldn't discharge them because there was no home to discharge them to. And so one of them had been living on the floor for 6 months. They were called a resident. And that was just mind-blowing to me, that somebody could be a resident in a hospital because they didn't have any place to live. It could wipe out the whole profit of that floor to have someone take up a bed full time. And
Yeah.
so you say that's everyone's problem. And so a lot of people have said to me, hey, Meg, I'm not paid to take care of the socio-determinants of health. I'm given a 10-minute slot as a physician or a nurse practitioner, or as a hospital, I'm reimbursed for this code. And I think you're seeing United Health opened up, you know, what really looks like a hotel or a place for people to live, because they understood that when you look at the person holistically, it affects the per cost per person, not to look at the socio-determinants of health. So the real solution around this is, one, is there reimbursement for taking care of the person, and are payers willing to look at that? And I think they are, because sometimes you're not paid, your reimbursement is held back, it's actually punitive, not an incentive, but it goes the other way, that if the person comes right back to the emergency room, you know, you won't get your payment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's punitive, but you're also seeing people lean into it to pay, you know, to want to pay for it and do the right thing. I think the second thing, and we saw this just recently out in California, they're democratizing the data, where people can now have access to the data, because you may not have known that I was homeless, or that I live alone, or that I don't have a car, or I don't have access to good nutrition. So if that data is not readily available in the EHR or in front of the provider, you don't know to access a social worker or access a nutritionist to get the care that you need. And so I'd read that California was looking at actually making that data available and working with a third party, so it was right in front of the practitioner, the same way a lab value would be, or another, you know, piece of clinical information. And then another thing I read too was that HSS and those that come out with Healthy People, they've now made the socio-determinants of health included in Healthy People 2020, which was great, because they're now basically saying it's important, we're giving it some light, and you should look at it as well. So I'm optimistic that people get it. And I've seen that there's been a few, you know, VC investments in areas that are called the socio-determinants of health. And I said, wow, that's amazing that we're now seeing public, you know, venture capitalists and CEOs come up with business models around it, because I think it's very much, I don't know how you solve for healthcare if you're not solving for the socio-determinants of health. That they're so linked that it would be impossible to treat somebody holistically without including it.
Do you see one of the biggest arguments against, say, companies trying to do preventative medicine is the economic argument, right? The idea that you're not going to be reimbursed for the value that you save for someone not getting sick, right? And you had brought this up before in terms of disease surveillance and all of these efforts to, you know, spread out and find disease literally before it happens, so that you save money on the back end, right? Do you see a pathway to this happening, right? Because in a lot of ways, that's revolutionary from the health system perspective, because, you know, if you play it out to the asymptote, you can actually recoup a lot of these costs that don't happen if you spare us the very bad outcomes by finding things early, at least in theory, which in practice is always difficult. But do you see that as a possibility? Do you see us with a path to get there?
Yeah, and the reason I do, and it's going to sound like a strange answer, and it's because of vertical integration. So you now see Aetna, you have a payer and a retailer and a PBM now becoming one. And what you need is time. So before, I might stay in a health plan for 2 years, so nobody would recoup that investment.
Exactly.
But now I might be in the Aetna CVS Caremark network for 7 years or 10 years. And I know that was a strategy. A lot of payers, you talk to payers, they're looking at having a more longer term relationship with the population. There's only 330 million of us, so everybody's trying to compete for the per capitas. And if you get somebody under management for 10 years, then you can do an ROI on the preventative care for me, you know. And I know
Right.
some places have done it. Cleveland Clinic has looked at this, and some of the larger health systems have looked at what does it mean over 10 years. I get it. Over 2 years, you may not recoup your cost, but if I'm in under your management for 10 years, and you're doing my drug, my retail, my mental care, my physical care, and you're taking care of me over a duration, I think we've got a real shot to make a case that it would pay off. Certainly pays off if you're in a government program, because you can be in that relationship for a really long time. So in fairness, it's the same reason why when they looked at employer programs, some of them didn't pan out very well. It didn't pay to, help me exercise, because maybe I wasn't around long enough that you saw the benefit, or maybe I was too young and relatively healthy. And so it was unfortunate that some of the data around these programs didn't pan out, and people would say, it's just not worth it. I'm not going to do it. It's better off giving you childcare, because that's a more notable benefit. But I think the longer we're under management, either with an employer or with a payer, we've got a real shot then to kind of look at longer term data and see if there's an ROI.
Yep. And one of the things that made me think about this yesterday was Grail filed their S1 to go public, right? So now there's at least one very high profile company looking at, genomic sequencing now for preventative things in the future. How early can we detect cancer, and, will we be able to treat it? Notably, Johnson & Johnson has their disease interception strategy. There's at least a few pillars there of, can we shift this business model or this healthcare model to early detection, and then the actual reduction of the disease. Proving that it works is difficult, because the trial is exceptionally difficult to run. You have to look very, very far into the future and believe that the outcomes are going to be there.
Yeah, it's one thing if it's targeted therapy and you're like, de-risking your investment because you want to make sure I actually, are going to respond to the therapy and that I have, the target. But it's another to just do, hey, let's run your whole panel and what if scenarios. Everybody's like, well, how do I pay for that? But that's been Moore's law. I mean, it's coming down so rapidly to run some of these tests. I think, as costs come down, people are around longer, and a lot more data comes out around the benefit. I think you'll start to see some uptake, but it's understandably a question, right? There's only limited resources. We're already strained. Nobody has a lot of extra money. So everybody's looking at this to say, where's the highest bang for the buck? And getting me to stop smoking sometimes might be a better use of funds. Although a long time ago, that wasn't something people cared about either, because all right, she's not going to be around. And if she moves on from the earth, I save money. So sometimes there was a perverse incentive.
Yeah. Well, this has real parallels to senior care, right? And you mentioned, older people in Florida at the Genius Bar, but you're thinking now about, people as they age. They have several different conditions, a lot of comorbidities, and really the idea of Alzheimer's is kind of the perfect specter for preventative medicine. It's incredibly difficult to run the trial because we don't know when people are going to actually get whatever we're classifying as Alzheimer's, and we don't really have a great way of tracking anything that we're going to do to prevent it. So it's another challenge of, how do we actually institute solutions now that we believe take care of people on a longer time scale, that we believe are going to have better outcomes in the future? It's a very, very difficult hypothesis to think about.
Oh yeah, it's crazy to think about it. And I think, that is like an obstacle to people living alone at home. I just told you how many people live alone at home, and most of the time it's a female. Females outlive males a little bit. And so you're home alone by yourself, and then you get Alzheimer's, and it makes it even, you then now need round the clock care. So I don't necessarily have a solution for it, but I do know if people had their choice, they would like to age at home, and we need to figure out a way to increase, the ability to do that. I was on the board of Senior Link, which helped stand up the field of caregivers. They put caregivers on the map, and most caregivers look like us. It's a sandwich generation where you just got done raising your kids, and now you're taking care of your parents or your spouse or partner's parents or relatives. And so you never seem to get a break. And so I think, we're really relying on caregivers and non-paid care to take care of seniors so they can age in place. And that's why I was really motivated by telehealth and Nest and all kinds of tools to be able to help monitor seniors. I'm able to look at what my mom is doing now in Florida because we can FaceTime. I also bought her a groovy watch that does her pulse ox, her blood pressure, and I get those readings on my screen. So I'm able to say, hey, how's it going? Or get walking, or get to the primary care doc, or let's talk about this. So I think technology is really going to help us as caregivers be able to take care of our aging, because not everyone will be able to afford round-the-clock care. Not everyone will need round-the-clock care, but I think we're moving in the right direction because of companies like SeniorLink and technology and other people kind of throwing a lot of money at the space because they know that's where people want to be. My mom's already said it. You know, I've asked her to buy the long-term care insurance. She said, there's no need. I'm not going anywhere. Remember, I'm going to stay here. You're on the board of SeniorLink and you've got me the watch. And I said, all right, well, there'll become a time, you know, at 100, maybe you're not there. She says, of course, well, I'll live with you.
And you're like,
Did you? Apparently, you didn't know that was the plan.
No, I didn't know. No, it's amazing how these things, yeah. I think I'm inheriting $100. So there's not even a fund to like.
That should cover it, right?
To cover it, yeah.
So if you put your investment hat on now, if you put your investor hat on, what are some of the things that you look, first of all, what does your investment horizon look like within the funds that you operate? And within that horizon, what are some of the areas that you're looking at that you think are promising, or what are some of the areas that you kind of don't really know if they have legs right now and you kind of want to see what they do?
Yeah, good question. So I tend to work with people that are long-term hold, you know, companies or family offices. So they're looking at a 5 to 7 year horizon, which is great because I was once a corporate strategist. So you can actually put a play together and grow and build something. I like to grow and build things. I'm not really a debt expert. Like, let's load a bunch of debt on this and let's flip it in 2 years. Although, listen, if you get lucky and you pick the right space, sometimes you have an asset that's really rare and special and people want to buy it. But I genuinely like to build things. I also always ask how I'm going to get paid to do something. And I've always found that pharma pays. They're innovating. We've had an unprecedented, I'm calling it the endless summer in biotech in terms of IPOs and funding. And it's not just because of COVID. There's a lot of other energy in other programs outside of COVID. And we've had a record number of IPOs with phase 1 and phase 2 data. That was never what I saw when I was growing up in pharma. So I think the innovation has just been so exciting. So I spend a lot of my time in how do I serve pharma. So I invested in Parexel. I'm an investor and founder in K2, which is a venture debt firm that gives money to life science companies. And so I love finding ways to work with pharma. I think the most exciting area right now is in the CDMO distribution and logistics space. How are we moving vaccines? I mean, I think people just assume you put an ice pack in a box and you send it, and it just couldn't be further from the truth. We've got, you know, -80, -20. You're moving diamonds. You're literally moving diamonds. It has to be tracked and traced and watched every step of the way. And there's like 20 steps. And I ran the specialty division at Cardinal. And so I got to see this up front and personal about how important it is when you're moving oncolytics. We used to plan for a year in advance, and to make sure the system ran well, I used to send out Godiva chocolates to make sure they didn't melt and that they arrived in time, just to make sure the pumps was working and everybody was synced up and that the stuff was tracked and traced. So I find this really fascinating. You saw PCI just trade, I think, for $3 billion. And so I'm very, very interested in that space, spending a lot of time in it. It's also incredibly expensive because everyone else had the same idea. So that's one area I like. As you mentioned, I love looking at public health. I feel like I'm one of the few public health capitalists. Those things usually don't go together. People think, oh, public health, so it doesn't pay, you know? And so that would be the social determinants of health. That would be obesity. That would be care in the home. I mean, there's a lot of ways to play public health. And so I wish somebody would open up a fund that says, hey, we also are a public health capitalist. We'd love to do that. So I find my affinity is for large, important problems. Care in the home is large. Obesity is large. Addiction is large. Seniors is a large population. Those things are really important. And then I always love enjoying pharma. So I tend to be bullish on all of those things, but I'm not the only one that's bullish. I find that I have an idea and then suddenly someone gets there before me, which means I didn't have the idea long enough.
Yeah.
I find places where the government reimburses sometimes tough. That can be really tough. You've got to be, you know, pretty sophisticated if you're, you know, depending on Medicaid to pay you back. You just need to understand that. That can be sometimes more of a sophisticated investment. I don't usually hunt in those areas, although I find them uber important. And same with Medicare. It's half the payment in the United States is government pay. So you kind of have to figure out how to work within that.
Yeah, and it's got to be encouraging to see things like the Livongo Teladoc merger and companies like Virta Health actually making headway into those spaces that previously the big question, like you said, is how are you going to get paid, right? And the other thing too, we think about cell therapies, CAR T therapies that are some of the biggest things that have come out of the biotech world in the last 5 or 10 years. All of those things have a much more complicated supply chain than delivering a small molecule to anywhere.
And also, I think, and to your point, I think real world evidence. I mean, I never thought in my lifetime there'd be $1 million drug, let alone a $2 million drug. And so I think phase 4 is probably more important now than phase 3. Getting an efficacy signal and getting a drug approved used to be all you had to do. That's really not the case anymore. Just because you approved doesn't mean you're going to justify a payment that someone's going to reimburse you, and you're not going to be put on 5-step 4th level formulary, and then you're not going to get approved. So I think anyone doing real world evidence, and there's a lot of companies focused on that now, is really exciting. I spend a lot of time there as well, because I think how these get paid for is everyone's problem, and the justification and going at risk around payment is something that I think is really exciting for biopharma and actually really needed.
And we actually do a lot of work as a trade association, talking to policymakers about reimbursement, particularly on the public programs, because as we have an increasing number of small biotech companies looking at transformative curative therapies, the reimbursement is a top question, right? And they're going to have to be able to have those therapies reimbursed in order to continue to get investment dollars. And so even sometimes before they know they need to think about that, we're thinking about that for them as an industry position.
That's great. Yeah, we need it. We need more to be done for sure.
You also just had a great prelude to one of our panels next week on real world evidence. I mean, one of the big themes in these webinars, we've had a lot of people come and talk about the convergence of the biopharma industry and data, right? We have many more sources of data about you, about your health than we've ever had before.
Yep.
In some cases, the sources are really high value and really good. In some cases, they're consumer devices that we hope get better. But a big thread has been this convergence of your data as a patient and what it means from a healthcare perspective.
Yep. I'm improvising.
That's all right.
Look, we do it all the time.
We do it, absolutely. We do it all the time.
The UPS guy, you just tell him, hey, listen, when I'm on.
Okay, sorry, I was just reading one of the questions here. So we have 2 intriguing ones to kind of get us to the end here. And the first one is, what does a primary care physician look like over the next 10 years? Do you find that role is going to be enhanced or diminished?
Oh, only enhanced. In fact, there's a shortage. I forgot the numbers, but it's in the tens of thousands that we're going to have a shortage by 2021. So I honestly think that's the tip of the spear, whether it's a nurse practitioner in primary care or a primary care physician, that really is the go-to person, and there's a shortage. And I think we're asking a lot of them. We're asking them to be technologically savvy. As Jennifer just went into around reimbursement, they didn't go to school and get an MBA to spend half their time doing reimbursement. We're also cutting the amount of face time that they have with their patients, and they'll tell you, I wish I had a half an hour. There's no way I'm going to entertain a discussion on the socio-determinants of health or mental health if I've only got 10 minutes. So I think we're putting a lot on them, and it's just getting more complicated. And so I think telehealth and lots of other digital strategies are going to be able to help scale and leverage them. I also think let's hear it for the trade degree, whether it's, med techs or other people that can help take on the burden of things so everyone can work to the top of their license, so the dialogue with the patient can be really customized and very focused, because no one has a lot of time to be sitting there doing phlebotomy while they're trying to have a really delicate discussion about Alzheimer's. So I think it would be great if we spent more money and more people were able to go get 1- and 2-year trade degrees, so we can kind of take some of the burden off some of the frontline caregivers to actually do more care and less administration and less bureaucracy.
Yeah, I was literally just going to ask you the same question about nurse practitioners, right? Do we need, do we need more nurses, and do we need them to do more things and shoulder a greater burden of, maybe burden is the wrong word, but a greater share of the actual healthcare responsibility within our system? I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways we have a shortage of bodies. We have a shortage of people that are actually delivering care.
Yeah, and yesterday I saw someone send a tweet that Amazon now has $150,000 jobs. And if you're a manager of Chipotle, it's like $100,000 job. You realize a lot of people in healthcare can't break the $100,000 point. I think the salary for a nurse in the United States is $77,000. So there's 4 million of them, and we probably need another 4 million. And you're asking them to do a lot. And as we saw with the pandemic, many people are literally putting their life on their line for us. And it's only going to get more complicated. So I think there really needs to be a larger discussion about healthcare workers, celebrating them, making them cool degrees and things that young kids still want to do. Because a lot of my physician friends said I didn't spend 12, 15 years to do all this bureaucracy. And I think a lot of people have been dismayed about what they've had to do that is not patient facing. And I think we've got to bring that back and make it something that is more about science and making people feel better and wellness, and really something that you want to do versus something that you went to school for and now find that it's not really what you signed up for.
Yeah.
And I also think starting earlier, right? And in communities that haven't traditionally sent as many students into healthcare and medicine, I think focusing on those communities to increase the desire to be, to study healthcare and to study science degrees, and that makes a lot of sense. But we have to
and they'll go back in their own community. I saw this on the Indian reservation. I went back a few years later, and some of the patients' children were now nurses and some were in medical school. And I thought, wow, that is amazing, because they're going to take care of their own. They're going to go back to where they live. And so the cycle continues. So it's a really good point, Jennifer.
Yeah, I'd really like to think that one of the things that comes out of this is we look at how, science and healthcare across the board has, answered the bell during COVID, right? Whether it's people on the research side, whether it's people innovating in clinical trials, whether it's people looking at frontline care. I mean, when we had Barbara Murphy on, we literally went through this. They all came together. They pulled their strategy together. Everyone basically stepped up and said, this is how we have to handle this challenge. And I hope that those messages reverberate where people notice, especially younger people, notice what the industry did, notice what healthcare did in general, and actually see that as something cool. So yeah. I promise you, this is not a planted question, but we have one of your former students from 2014 that said, we talked about, upcoming trends like consumerism and retailization of healthcare. And you've talked a little bit about them today, but what do you think are going to be the trends in the business of healthcare in the next decade?
Oh my God, of course that student asked that, and they should know the answer. Like, we did this like the first night of class and put it in like a bottle that goes into the ocean to see, what happens. I've been spending a lot of time, and I was not an early adopter of this, but this idea of longevity and people wanting to be the best version of themselves at 40 and 50 and 60 and 70 and 80. So whether people are wearing Whoop apps or being really cute in and using MyFitnessPal to lose weight and stuff, I think we're going to, and it's not that, okay, I'm going to be 100 and I'm going to look 60. That's not what this is about. But how do you be your own, Olympic athlete inside yourself and the best version of yourself? So I actually think a major trend is still going to be, this idea of, understanding your own genome, wearing whatever your choice of watch or gadget is to make you perform better. And I think that's going to be interesting. Personal medicine for yourself and being the best version of yourself mentally, right, physically, and emotionally, especially coming out of COVID, right? You were given kind of this opportunity to come through it better and really reflect on what what you want out of life and to be healthy, and that a lot of people got a real scare that it could be taken away from them. So I think a major trend is going to be kind of healthcare looking more consumer-esque. I think a lot more companies and a lot more young people are becoming venture capitalists in this space and really inventing on new things. That's of huge interest to me. On the other side, not to be a Debbie Downer, I think payment is an issue. We're at 18% of GDP. We seem to always be at 18% of GDP. We always are. It might have slipped to 17 and then it comes right back up. We are a nation that likes to consume our healthcare. So it's going to stay at 18% of GDP. I don't really see that changing. So I think for me, people that can innovate around payment and outcomes and design, not very sexy like a watch, but needed. Nobel laureate level work would be on the payment side of healthcare. And I think it's something that should be applauded and found as interesting and not, boring and process. Process innovation is actually something that is really needed in healthcare. So anything that helps with payment, I'm really interested in. But then on the cool side, I do think this idea of living your best life longer, there's a lot of funding and a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, I don't have it on today, but I've started, I guess about a month ago, sleeping with my Aura ring and tracking all of the, the Apple Watch. And yeah, it is interesting to see what we have access to about ourselves from a consumer level that we just, you woke up and you either felt tired, but now I know exactly how my sleep was. And I don't know, sometimes that's better and sometimes it's not.
Worse, right? Yeah, but you're in tune with it. My husband's walking around with a Whoop app and he's like, I'm 40% recovered. I'm like, okay, so you're supposed to go back to bed or what? I feel like people are, a lot more interested in what they're doing. And also you can do your blood pressure at home. You can do your EKG at home. Like, we're giving people so many diagnostic tools that people are learning. Doesn't mean they're good at it or they should diagnose themselves. But the point is, like, it's a lot more accessible. It's no longer about having to go to a lab and waiting a week to get real-time information about how you're feeling. I think we've come a long way on that.
Yeah, you have some reinforcing options to take charge of your own healthcare, at least giving you some level of data. And hopefully those data sources all start to march down the road towards approaching, medical device quality data as opposed to consumer app quality data. But it's a start, right? A lot of this is a start for uptake. How do you get people interested in it? And when you do that, in theory, the market should bring things to where they should be to deliver more care. So this is another good question. So there was a JAMA editorial recently that said the fourth year of medical school should be a year in the field doing public health. What do you think?
100%. Awesome. Whoever's idea that was, that's great. I think it should be part of everyone's program. People always say to me, should I get an MBA or get an MPH? If you're in healthcare, I always say to people, get an MPH. Unless you're going straight finance, the policy, regulation, the epidemiology, the statistics, everything you learn is really what makes healthcare go around. And so I think public health is managing a population, and we've moved from just looking at someone as an individual, and there's been a real reckoning, especially in disparities of health, lots of disparities of how people do not get the same care. And I think you have to understand that, or you're not able to treat a population. So I think it would be great. Do you need a year? I don't know, but I think certainly time. A lot of the students in my class are dual MD, MPH. Some of them are CEOs, MPH. Some of them are getting MBAs and MPHs. So I think the pandemic put the MPH degree on the map. Suddenly it's like, whoa, you're an epidemiologist. It's like the coolest cat at a dinner party now. Whereas before it was like, what a weirdo. Are you hunting in a random part of the world for a weird disease I've never heard of? I think people now understand how important surveillance and prevention is. So I'm a huge fan of the public health degree, especially at Columbia University, to give it a plug.
Yep. So we have one more provocative question to kind of take us into the end here. And it goes along the lines of, you said, really, I think, of understanding patients and understanding where a lot of healthcare comes from. So, how can we have health insurance get away from, say, being a middleman, if you will, and being more proactive in solving patient care issues, right? This again comes back to outcomes, right? How do we get healthcare invested in outcomes rather than the transactional nature of where we are now?
Yeah, well, that's tough. Listen, the whole point of insurance, right, is to manage risk. It's the same reason you have car insurance. So lots of people need to buy into it so we can spread the pool and manage the risk. So we've kind of got to move from it being, an apparatus that solely looks at risk to somehow there's an incentive to take care of me for 10 years. And I think, as I said, I think the more we get people signed up somewhere for longer than a year or two, where they can be a closer relationship with the insurance provider, to look at me as an individual and as a member of the population that they're underwriting to say these things matter. You need to care about my migraine, or you need to care about my weight. And it needs to matter, and there needs to be outcomes around it. So for me, it's always about the data and the support to ask a payer to do that. But I think if they're investing in me for 10 years and I'm investing in them, there's been some discussion that a solution might be like an allocation. I get a 10-year allocation for my care, and I can use that care as I see fit. It's also why your deductible goes up and you have to pay more into it. So maybe there's a way that things that matter to me, I pay more into. I'm not a smoker, never would be. So, but part of my insurance is underwriting other people that smoke. So is there a better way to start thinking about how we underwrite insurance and think about insurance? Because some people don't need it when they're very young, and then boom, you need it in the last 5 years of your life, and you basically, have blown through your allocation. So for me, it's more of an actuarial question about what do we want to pay for, and what is the ROI on that? And I think it should be discussed, because you should care about what I'm doing over 25 years and how to think about that. Maybe I'm buying the hip that I need at age 25 and I'm holding it for when I need it when I'm 50. Maybe you look at somebody across their lifespan. I don't know. It's a really intellectually difficult question, but it's got to move from just risk and looking at it as a car accident versus maintenance.
Yeah. And it's also hard because the cost to the system changes dramatically as we age.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it's hard to quantify that.
Yeah.
You have to have a lot of people start buying. You have to have a lot of people start buying hips at 25, and half of them may not need them, but everybody has to buy them. So we have a couple.
Concept, yeah.
We have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to give you a little bit of an opportunity to talk about the Harlem Children's Zone. Again, your book is Ascending Davos. We're going to send the link out to everybody that's been on these calls. I have the book. I read the book. It's a great book. It's really engaging, and all of the profits go towards the Harlem Children's Zone. So I wanted to give you a couple minutes to tell everybody about what the Children's Zone does and the kids that it helps.
Yeah, so the Harlem Children's Zone was founded by Jeffrey Canada. He spoke at my Columbia graduation. I sat in the audience, and he basically was talking about the importance, back to the socio-determinants of health, back to everything we've talked about on this call, the important that an education is a great equalizer. It's a great equalizer in life, and it's a great equalizer in health. And if you're not literate and you're not educated, you may not put a premium on your health. You may not be able to get a job that gives you health insurance. So it all ties back to having an education. So as I sat there in the audience at my graduation, watching him speak, I felt so lazy that, my God, he dedicated his whole life to get kids into kindergarten and then basically backstopped them and guaranteed that they were going to go to college. It never left me. So 15 years later, when I was in a position to say, I never forgot about that, I decided that the proceeds of my book would go to the Harlem Children's Zone, because I wouldn't be here without my education and my degrees. It was the great equalizer. I was a B student, really good at track and field. So I kind of knew my legs were going to, run me literally and figuratively through life. But I lost my dad in high school, and there was talk that maybe there wasn't money for college. And I was lucky to get a scholarship, but I had friends on the track team that were poor and not so lucky, and they didn't get to go. And so education to me is everything. And it's not just going back and getting a formal degree. I tell people in my book, take a CFO to lunch, be better at math, understand how a company makes money. And so I felt really emboldened that Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone figured it out. And so I just said every dollar would go to the book. I never thought that I'd be writing a check for $5,000 to the Harlem Children's Zone. I actually thought I was going to have to go into my savings and goose the check, because I would be so embarrassed to say, I didn't sell any book. here's $40, but here's my personal savings account. I'll goose it
Yeah.
up. So the fact that so many people bought the book and we sent thousands of dollars. And by the way, some people just said, hey, aside from buying the book, I wrote a check in there. They're doing great work. And right now, kids with no internet and no ability for social interaction. And a lot of kids come to school for lunch and food and stability and security and safety. It's not just the Harlem Children's Zone. It's something I think we need to appreciate across the United States. But listen, if you want my book, I will send it to you for free. If you write a donation to the Harlem Children's Zone, that would be more important to me. But thank you both for giving that the time and it's due. I really appreciate that. It says a lot about you guys.
All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, Meg. This has been fantastic. We can sign off. I encourage everybody to come to our annual meeting next week, Tuesday and Wednesday. It's going to be fantastic. Thank you, Meg.
And
Thank
now
you.
you're going to sleep.
Klaus is worn out. Klaus can't take any more public
Really?
health.
Very sorry, but you saw
And now,
how I
right?
improvised. That's the emergency room training.
Yes.
Very
Thank
odd.
you.
Congrats, you
Well
guys.
done.
Thanks for a great chat.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.